Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the De facto podcast. I'm Anthony Bois, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest for this evening, Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, who I'm sure many, if not most of our listeners and viewers already know as Dr. CBS, or you may know her as Black Left AF on the site formerly known as Twitter. For those of you who do not yet know Dr. CBS, she's the Associate Professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University and a 2023-24 visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. She's the author of Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, which was just published about a week ago, I'd say, by the University of Chicago Press, and which is going to be the topic of this evening's conversation. She's also the co-author with Angelo Hearn of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and the co-editor of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings with Jody Dean, and of Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Postcolonial State. Dr. CBS has also widely published in peer-reviewed journals such as Small Axe, Souls, the Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, and CLR James Journal, and in popular publications like Monthly Review, Boston Review, Essence Magazine, The Nation, Teen Vogue, Black Perspectives, and Black Agenda Report. Finally, she is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Hello, welcome, Dr. CBS. Great to finally meet you and have you on. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So I want to say right off the bat that I really enjoyed reading this book, Black Scare, Red Scare, for so many reasons. But just want to say, kind of by way of introduction, that the book covers a period that you dub the Black Scare, Red Scare longue durée, and it offers a theory of the development and maintenance of U.S. capitalist racism from above and below as an ideological formation, a mode of economic exploitation, and a mode of anti-communist governance, stretching back before the Bolshevik Revolution, through the Bolshevik Revolution, World War I, World War II, and up through the Cold War years, and also up through the present. So you really cover a lot, a massive kind of time period in just over 300 pages or so. So I just wanted to laud you for your ability to provide such a detailed and meticulous analysis with such lucidity, and for your concision in rendering such this massive topic and time period so creatively and deftly, and probably most importantly of all, so convincingly. So I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Of course. I want to begin by asking you a little about what inspired you to take on this topic. Can you talk a little bit about your research and your activism, and what led you down this path toward this work of scholarship?
Yeah, so this is like the number one question that I've been asked so far, and basically, so at first I was like, okay, I wrote my dissertation about anti-communism, anti-radicalism, and anti-Blackness. That was one of the sort of guiding things in my dissertation, which is true, but I was looking through some files today, and actually way back in 2012, around the time I was working on my qualifying exams in grad school, for one of my position papers, I was writing about a materialist theory of the African diaspora, where I was looking at global capitalism and coloniality as a sort of driving features of the African diaspora, and then challenging the sort of cultural turn or the emphasis on culture in diaspora studies as it had been constituted, at least by the 1990s, especially with the publication of like Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic. And that was also a theme of my dissertation. And so, and one of the questions that sort of animated that theorizing of diaspora was, why was the sort of interrogation of culture abstracted from political economy? And also, why were sort of kind of Marxist and Pan-African thinkers kind of marginalized in what came to constitute African diaspora studies? So, and then from there, so thinking about sort of the political economy of Black abjection on the one hand, and then the sort of lack of political economy explanation on the other hand began me thinking about anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism, and then specifically anti-communism. That became a sort of synecdoche, or the sort of overarching method by which various forms of anti-radicalism were reproduced at the level of the state, society, and then institutions. So in the case of my dissertation, I was looking at the university. So that is essentially how I came to this research. And then, just a broader question that I always had was like, why does the United States sort of disdain, oppress, and hate Black people? And why does the United States sort of repress and marginalize and exclude, leftist radical thought? And then how do these two sort of enemies of the state, if you will, come together in U.S. sort of discourse, policy, and practice? In terms of organizing, I came to organizing really late. I joined the Black Alliance for Peace, I want to say in 2020. And so, and that was sort of while I was in the process of writing Black Scare, Red Scare. So I had already been thinking about these ideas for a very long time, but sort of organizing gave me the opportunity to really kind of apply those ideas and think about how to make them more accessible, especially through like political education, how to make them sort of out, liberate them from the ebony tower, if you will, and really apply them to the types of organizing and the types of concerns in Black Alliance for Peace, like AFRICOM, like the 1033 program, later on Cop City, the neo-colonial invasion of Haiti, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm really interested in particular this idea of kind of rooting things back in political economy from the culturalist sort of discourse, which is clearly what your book is all about. And maybe that kind of feeds into my second question, actually, because in your introduction to the book, you write that some of your objectives are to, quote, correct archival distortions, reevaluate what counts as a legitimate source, resuscitate and reinterpret and challenge racial and intellectual chauvinism, among other things. Can you talk a little bit about these objectives and how they kind of manifest in your writing?
Yeah, so I talk about, elsewhere I've talked about like this idea of intellectual McCarthyism and how Black radicals in particular are kind of either erased completely, or their ideas are liberalized and sanitized. So if you know about somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, you would know about like Souls of Black Folk, for example, that he founded the NAACP, but you wouldn't know about, In Battle for Peace, or the sort of Marxist influences of Black Reconstruction, or the fact that he was a member of the Council on African Affairs, that he joined the Communist Party in 1961. And so part of what I want to do in this work is like lift up the ideas, theories, and praxis of Black radicals generally, but specifically Black people in and around the Communist Party, who are thinking deeply about the intersections of proletarian revolution and the Negro question. And the Negro question is actually really central to understanding, especially U.S. imperialism, and U.S.-led capitalist accumulation and exploitation. And I talk about sort of resuscitation and reinterpretation because there's a lot of discourse now coming, especially out of like Black feminist history, about like silences in the archive and what's missing from like the historical archive. But the archives that I work with, it's there, but they're just marginalized or ignored or avoided because they're full of ideas and writings and scholarship by folks who were deemed illegitimate, who didn't count as knowledge producers because ostensibly they're parroting some party line, or they're dupes of Moscow, or they don't have any original ideas, or they're just they're biased, right? That their ideas are not objective, and they don't really count as scholarship. And so in terms of sources, like I'm looking at, I really like pamphlets, for example, like the pamphlets that different communists will put together that serve like a dual function of like political education, but also like fundraising. Looking in like the theoretical journals of the Communist Party, which are often marginalized as sources, looking at minutes from different, internationalist meetings, those types of things that are there and they are abundant, but that people typically, again, because they're not considered to be, they don't fit into liberal narrations of, freedom, democracy, whatever. They're simply left, or they're left out, or they are. So, for example, you might talk about Claudia Jones as a feminist, but you don't talk about the fact that she's a communist, right? Or that sort of gets assumed. You talk about, same with somebody like Louise Thompson Patterson, you talk about her as a member of like the Harlem Renaissance. I'm the best friend of Langston Hughes, but not as a communist. So my book is meant to sort of lift up those ideas, but also take them seriously as the basis for the type of analyzing and theorizing that I'm doing.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. I can see how that kind of folds in your work with Jody Dean as well. That organized fight win.
Right.
So actually, it's kind of a follow up to talking about Claudia Jones and Louise Thompson Patterson. One example that you write about are these Black domestic workers and the gendered realities of the what you call the structural location of Blackness in New York's virtual slave markets. Um, can you talk about a little bit about that work? Grace Campbell, Esther Cooper, Claudia Jones's work on triple oppression, and you kind of already broached this idea of how it informs your analysis, but maybe you can get a little deeper into some of these concepts.
So triple oppression is really important because the way we might think about it, like in academia, is as like a precursor to intersectionality, and that is not, for me, that's not what it is, right? It is an anti-imperialist approach to understanding the position of Black women, both in US, but also kind of global political economy. And the oppression has to do with them being women, Black people, and workers. And so being a woman fits you to be in charge of reproduction, right? Being a Black woman makes it economic necessity to be largely in charge of production and reproduction. And then also being a Black woman means that you are, paid less, you're reduced to domestic labor, considered to be the servants of others, you're locked out of other forms of industry, you have contingent, precarious, piecemeal labor. Sometimes you're not even paid in wages. White folks will try to pay you in clothes or food scraps or whatever. And then there's a set of social relations that accompany this sort of generational emplacement or reduction of Black women simply to service work, whether it's in private homes or in like laundries, for example. And then as workers, of course, Black women are subject to the same type of surplus value extraction as other types of workers, but it's an extreme form because, again, sometimes there's no real payment at all, right? And then there's no legal recourse. So when people are thinking about, when unions, for example, are thinking about labor protection, they're not thinking about the work that Black women do, which is why a lot of these people begin to push for like a domestic workers union, that if we're really thinking about workers, the white male factory worker is only one aspect of what we need to be thinking about and what we need to be considering. So Grace Campbell in 1928, here's how she explained Black women's triple oppression. She said, Negro women workers are the most abused, exploited, and discriminated against of all American workers, not only by the capitalist system and the employers, but by unenlightened race prejudice, which is found even in the working class and is used by the employers to drive a wedge between Black and white workers and thus destroy their unity and fighting power. Now, that's really important because I think we'll talk a little bit more about the structural location of Blackness in a second, but part of what I write about is that it has class dynamics, but it's not reducible to class because it often facilitates cross-class collaboration, which is part of what Grace Campbell is talking about, that through white supremacy and, or what she calls racial prejudice, there's a interest convergence between like white workers and white owners to the detriment of Black workers generally, but in this case, you know, Black women particularly, because of the nature and content of their labor.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of brings us to this notion of super exploitation, which is something you write about a lot in the book. And it's part of the structural location of Blackness that you explicate also. Can you explicate that concept for us, and how it is not how anti-Black racism and anti-Black radicalism are not simply byproducts or entangled in U.S. Capitalist society, but are instrumental and therefore intrinsic to this anti-communist mode of governance that you're examining?
Yeah, so super exploitation has to do with the intensity, form, and racial basis for surplus value extraction, whereby oftentimes the form of sort of intensified exploitation to which Black people are subjected for much of their history emulates or has a lot of the characteristics of enforced servitude. So obviously it's rooted in racial slavery. And it results from the convergence of capitalism, racialism, and white supremacy, imperialism, and then violence, and violence which is constitutive of the condition of Black labor. It's not a sort of addendum to it, it's constitutive. So for example, somebody like Hubert Harrison, when he's talking about enslaved Africans, you know, he says, you know, violence, there's a direct correlation between the intensity of violence and the amount of value that's extracted from Black people. And so the violence becomes part and parcel of what it means to be a Black worker. And then and so this reality of super exploitation, it exceeds the conditions of exploitation to which the white working class is subjected. And according to people like Harry Haywood, it actually then it drives all wages, for example, down. It drives all working conditions down. And it allows, you know, and then Du Bois talks about like this, you know, psychological wage that this affords white workers who are also extremely exploited, right? But who are still placed above Black people and whose conditions are marginally better. Therefore, you know, they have this epidermal capital, if you will, that at least allows them to evade particular forms of brutality that are considered to be reserved for like Black folks. And then, so I'll just read a little bit about the structural location of Blackness. But I'll first say, I was really trying to figure out like what is sort of anti-Blackness, right? And so one of my critiques of Afro-pessimists is that there's no distinction between, because of the ontological nature of their argument, there's really no distinction between Blackness and anti-Blackness. But to really think sort of concretely about anti-Blackness, there has to be some type of understanding of what Blackness is. And for me, it's not just, you know, it's not something that's really ontological. There's a political ontology to it, right? But it's not ontological as such. And so, you know, I say born out of racial slavery, the structural location of Blackness exceeds the category of race, is not reducible to class, and does not fit the specifications of caste. Elsewhere, I've written about why caste is not an acceptable analytic for the United States. Whereas in the context of U.S. capitalist political economy, race demarcates social status. Structural location describes a material relationship inextricable from imperialism and sustained through a combination of political, economic, and discursive processes to which any challenge is configured as destructive to U.S. society. So it's not only that it demarcates a sort of material or economic relationship, but then to challenge that relationship, to challenge that positioning becomes a threat to the state because it is a fundamental threat to its ability to accumulate. And And then I talk about sort of, while structural location has a class basis, because it exists within a capitalist system with an exploitative and antagonistic relationship between capital and labor, it's not reducible to a class relationship because it has generally served as a source of cross-class collaboration. Du Bois referred to this as kind of democratic despotism through like ideologies like white supremacy. It's also facilitated cross-class collaboration between Black people. So there is intra-racial class differentiation, but by and large, Black people have worked as a racial bloc to challenge like white supremacy. Yeah, so I guess the last thing I'll say about the structural location of Blackness and super exploitation is that they are constitutive of like US political economy. It's not something that's sort of episodic or happenstance. It changes over time, obviously, as there's changes in political economy. But this is something that is part and parcel of what capitalist racism is.
Right. It's a nexus. It's not a byproduct. I think that's something you make very clear in your argument. Let's talk about another feature of the Black Scare, Red Scare, longue durée, which was this conflation of Black radicalism with Bolshevism, or even with Germanism in some instances, and really the misconstrual of the push for Black self-determination as a form of outside agitation. Now, in the book, you write about what you call the genres of radical Blackness: the West Indian, the outside agitator, the Black Red, and the Red Black, and there's some other fellow travelers involved. How are these categories, which are almost like a Venn diagram of racial and political subjugation, used as a cudgel to justify surveillance, terrorism, imperialism, and so on? Maybe you can talk about this in the context of the case of Marcus Garvey, which seems to be an important one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these kind of tropes, if you will, of radical Blackness, it's not exhaustive, but I was just thinking about what are the sort of, when I'm looking at the sources that ground my project, like what are the types of ideations, right? What are the types of dangers that keep on coming up? And so the West Indian, I describe this like figure as a foreigner. They are susceptible to radicalism and radical ideas. They tend to have both race and class analysis. And this can be a literal West Indian, right? It's literally people who come from the West Indies, but also it is, again, it's tropological. So it's kind of like they embody a particular danger. And so especially like in, the first half of the 20th century, there is this idea that West Indians are particularly susceptible to like Garveyism and to communism. So there is an overrepresentation of West Indians like in the early communist parties, as well as in the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And in fact, when the first, I think it's William Worley, who's like the first Black agent to work for the BI, his job was to infiltrate the UNIA, also the African Blood Brotherhood. But part of what he argued was that, the Bolshevik line was all up and through Garveyism, and that it was, primarily a West Indian organization, that, African Americans are much more patriotic and they're not falling for this sort of foreign ideology. It's primarily West Indians. And then later on, Claudia Jones talks about how the McCarran-Walter Act, which I'll talk about probably again a little bit later, but that this codified the West Indian as threat to the U.S. state by limiting immigration from the Caribbean to just 100 people. And she says, while the U.S. is accepting, fascist scum by the droves from Europe, it's limiting immigration from the entire Caribbean to just 100 people. The outside agitator is this, and we still hear this discourse, right? It's somebody who is typically a Northerner, typically some type of newspaper editor or an educated person who is thought to be kind of proselytizing or leading ignorant Black folk astray, right? And that their education is their danger, right? The more educated that, and then so this is also an idea about like why Black people shouldn't have education, because the more educated they become, the more inviting they are to foreign ideas, whereas ignorant Blacks are susceptible to radical intrigue. Educated Black folks become more dissatisfied with their natural position of inferiority, and therefore become more susceptible to radical, or more amenable to radical ideas. So somebody like A. Philip, the early A. Philip Randolph, when he's the editor with Chandler Owen of The Messenger, is like the archetypal outside agitator. They hate him. He's in New York. He is his newspaper is a national newspaper. It has an interracial subscription, and he's considered to be sort of rallying up the Blacks and pushing them towards armed self-defense and social equality, which is, dating white women, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the outside agitator. And then you have the red, black, black, red, which interestingly, I first had the sort of name of this genre as the nigger communist, because number one, that's how Angelo Hearn was referred to throughout his trial. And number two, that is what I want to say it was Senator Rankin called Paul Robeson.
That's right.
But then there, you have these reviewers, and and some of the reader reports are like, this is probably going to be too jarring for people, so I changed it to red, black, black, red. But I say that this is probably the most odious genre, because this is actually a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And so not only are they Black, but they're also communist. So it's kind of like a double threat. Again, they're considered to be subversive, susceptible to the party line. They want to overthrow the US government by force or violence. They're trying to establish a, quote, nigger republic. This emanates from the Black Belt Nation thesis. In the South, they want to expropriate landowners. And, particularly odiously, they organize interracially and believe in racial equality. So Marcus Garvey's interesting here because, he is like the archetypal West Indian, but he also is still subjected to the Red Scare, even though he, especially after 1921, he's anti-communist. But he's attacked for his promotion of self-determination, and because he's anti-Euro-American imperialism, and in fact tries to set up a U.S., a Black colony, for lack of a better term, in Liberia. And the U.S. has plenty of economic interest in Liberia. And so this becomes a particular problem for the US state, along with sort of organizing poor and working class Black folks in ways that organizations like the NAACP had been effective at doing, and even the Communist Party. And so, Garvey is ultimately indicted, he's tried, incarcerated, and ultimately his sentence is commuted, but only so he can be deported. But, the Garvey movement was the largest movement, Black movement in history before or since. There are millions of members of the UNIA, and, European colonizers were particularly concerned about the UNIA and the newspaper, The Negro World, and how it was circulating in the colonies, especially in the Caribbean, but also on the African continent, and the consciousness that it was building among especially, among Black people across across class. And so, especially for J. Edgar Hoover, Garveyites sit alongside anarchists and Wobblies and Bolsheviks as dangerous outsiders that need to be neutralized.
And even in Garvey's, what you describe in the text as his right-wing shift, post-21, his anti-communism, he couldn't even be saved from the wrath of the Black Scare, Red Scare, given the shifting of his politics. And other figures like Ben Fletcher and A. Philip Randolph, as you just mentioned, that sort of anti-communism that someone like Randolph later espoused couldn't save him either. Could you talk a little bit about that? The Black anti-communists were not immune to this sort of policing and this surveillance.
Right. And so Black anti-communists are like the sort of anti-Soviet, anti-CPUSA. They might still be, you know, socialists or syndicalists in the case of like Fletcher and Randolph. But you know, Garvey, who early on was sort of laudatory of the Bolshevik Revolution and kind of praised Lenin, by 1921, he takes a rightward turn precisely because he's being red baited, but also because he had left the country to go on a fundraising tour for the Black Star Line, and J. Edgar Hoover worked very hard to have him not readmitted into the United States. And so a trip that was supposed to take like 30 days, he ended up being on for 6 months because he couldn't get back into the country. His lawyer was able to bribe some people in the State Department, so ultimately he came back, which only intensified, you know, Hoover's hatred of Garvey, even as Garvey began to openly condemn anti-communism, or to condemn communism, and, you know, talk about it, Marxism as a white man's ideology, and that if a war broke out between like the white workers and white capitalists, Black people would side with whoever benefited Black people the most. He also thought that, you know, a proletarian revolution would put the worst class of white folks in power, which is white workers, because, you know, when it comes to sort of direct racist violence, it is white working class people. It's, you know, they're the foot soldiers of capitalism, if you will. So that was his analysis, but he was still red baited. You know, his belief in self-determination was still equated or considered alongside like the Black Belt Nation thesis. You know, he was still considered a dangerous radical, even as he took on these anti-communist ideas. He did not curry favor with J. Edgar Hoover. And so people like so Fletcher, and the other reason why Garvey was hostile to the CPUSA was because they tried to infiltrate the UNIA and sort of siphon off some of the Black workers to bring them to the Communist Party. And in fact, the Black Belt Nation thesis was a response to the failure of the Communist Party to garner Black workers. And actually many Black communists were against the Black Belt Nation thesis. They didn't think it was the correct line, but Harry Haywood, who was the main architect of it, won out, and I write a bit about that. Similarly, Ben Fletcher, who was a Black member of the Industrial Workers of the World, likewise saw the Communist Party as trying to sort of sow dissent within chapters of the Industrial Workers of the World if they couldn't sort of take on a dominant position in different chapters. He was anti-Soviet Union. And so while he was a syndicalist, he just was untrusting of the Communist Party. But again, he was ultimately indicted and imprisoned by the US government. And so taking this anti-communist line wasn't something that protected him or that curried favor with the government. Likewise with A. Philip Randolph, you know, his anti-communism permeates his departure from the National Negro Congress in 1939, and then the formation of the March on Washington movement later on, which he made all Black in part to deter communists or to keep communists out, because communists are interracial in their organizing. But there's a report called the Racial Conditions Report that's commissioned by J. Edgar Hoover during World War II. And there's a whole section on the March on Washington movement where, you know, the agents argue that nonetheless, the March on Washington movement is infiltrated by communists. It espouses similar types of ideas. And so because it espouses similar types of ideas, it cannot be immune from communist intrigue, even as the report acknowledges that A. Philip Randolph is a staunch like anti-communist. So all of that to say that one doesn't have to be a communist, but to be anti-communist, number one, strengthens the state apparatus that's being brought against folks who care about any aspect of Black liberation or worker power. And it's not something that, now the Cold War liberals do get some concessions based on taking up a particular anti-communist line, but by and large, it's more hurtful than helpful, not least by sort of taking out some of the most able and competent organizers with internationalist connections, right? It's a celebration of their demise, which is just a pretext for an attack on radicalism in general.
And one of those, sort of can't remember how you just put it, but very capable organizers was W.E.B. Du Bois. And you talk about his the Peace Information Center, which did he found it or was he a part of it? And the Ban the Bomb petition. So even in that period of World War II and a little after, um, he the pro-peace movement was also seen as susceptible to the ideology of Moscow. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you call the threat of peace?
Yeah, so peace activism was like radical peace activism was considered to be sort of a Soviet machination. It was considered to be a way to undermine the United States, which was reliant upon warmongering and militarism for its role as its self-styled role as the international police. And so peace was considered to be anathema to like US national security. It was considered to be something that was a way to pull the wool over the eyes of the American public, to tacitly or explicitly back the Soviet Union. So W.B. Du Bois co-founds the Peace Information Center in 1950 with some comrades, primarily to circulate the Ban the Bomb petition, which was a global petition that, like, the most sort of signed global petition in world history, that essentially was meant to ban the nuclear bomb, right? To disarm or to get rid of nuclear armaments and to make it a war crime to use nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And this was considered by people like Dean Acheson, who was a Secretary of State, to be, again, a Moscow plot, a means by which the United States was being undermined from within. But the Peace Information Center did things like circulate peacegrams, which are kind of newsletters documenting different peace conferences and forms of organizing on behalf of peace. They had rallies, they would co-sponsor different events, and they were only in existence for about 8 months because they were put on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. They were hounded by the government. And it's because of his chairmanship of the PIC that Du Bois was actually indicted under the Foreign Agents Registration Act as an agent of a foreign power, that former power being Moscow. He was ultimately acquitted. And so this whole process is documented in he has a small pamphlet called I Take My Stand for Peace. He has a book called In Battle for Peace. And then he talks about it in his posthumously published autobiography, like this whole ordeal. But effectively, it literally was for advocating peace, specifically peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, that Du Bois, who's well into his 80s at this point, is indicted by the US government as an agent of a foreign power. And he has a lot of commentary on this, but part of what he says is that it's actually really sad that peace is antithetical to the United States, which is ostensibly supposed to be the protector of freedom and democracy. And that, it's actually quite telling that peace is considered a threat to national security, right? It's something that's foreign to the United States. So anyway, yeah, so that, part of that indictment coupled with continued repression over the next decade is part of the reason why in 1961 he joins the Communist Party and ultimately goes into exile in Ghana, where he died in 1963 on the eve of the March on Washington, actually.
Oh, so, interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, I want to back up just a little bit and ask you a little bit more about imperialism, specifically Wall Street imperialism, that you write about in this book. Haiti, Ethiopia, and Liberia, a little of which you've already mentioned. How are the Black Scare and the Red Scare folded into US imperialism abroad?
So for this part of my analysis, I drew a lot on Peter James Hudson's book, Bakers and Empire, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean. And then a report in terms of Haiti, James Weldon Johnson did like a 4-part series for The Nation called that was published as a kind of short book called Self-Determining Haiti. And then the information on on Liberia and Ethiopia, I got largely from The Life and Struggle of Negro Toilers, which was written by George Padmore in 1931, I believe. But essentially, part of what, when it comes to Haiti, so, the U.S. occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, and part of what I argue here is the ways that the Black Scare was really exported to Haiti. Haiti had long been a sort of specter of Black radical danger since the Haitian Revolution, right? And it had constantly, from the United States, France, and other imperial powers have been working since, enslaved Africans freed themselves to discipline Haiti into submission. But the U.S. occupation of Haiti by 1915 had a lot to do, as Peter James Hudson writes, had a lot to do with the financial colonization of Haiti, taking over its banks, opening up markets, expropriating labor, etc. And part and parcel of that was a sort of brutalization of Haitians that was not unlike the way that Blacks in the South were treated. Irrespective of class, Haitians were all treated like niggers, right? They were all subjected to extreme forms of brutality by the U.S. military. They're humiliated, and their labor through a system called corvée was extracted for either egregiously low wages or often for free. And this was similar to the case in Liberia. Liberia was really important because it was really the only foothold the United States had on the African continent prior to World War II because of the Berlin Conference. And so, Liberia was, especially after World War I, Liberia became an important site for rubber. Like once the British had abandoned rubber production in Liberia, this is when Firestone moves in. This is part of the conflict with Garvey, is that, Garvey is trying to start, he has, amicable relationship initially with the Liberian government, but once Firestone begins to lay claim to the rubber plantations in Liberia, the U.S. state begins to sort of discipline the UNIA and Garvey's plans to establish a colony there with the sort of participation and support of like the Liberian ruling class. And then Ethiopia, it's a similar situation, especially after, starting during World War I, but especially after World War II, the United States begins to provide military support and other types of technical support for Ethiopia that, undermines Ethiopian sovereignty, even though it's ostensibly one of the two nations that have never been colonized in Africa, the other of which is Liberia. But part of that section shows is that U.S. imperialism is operating all the time and is undermining Liberian and Ethiopian sovereignty in a de facto way. And again, the same types of racial logics that structure how Black people are treated in the United States are then sort of exported to these other places, not least because these are the same types of people who are involved in these excursions. So it's the same types of officers who are involved in the Spanish American War. Some of the older people, people who are involved in taking over the Philippines are then going to places like Haiti and Liberia and facilitating the same types of oppression.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really that's a really interesting part of the book, establishing those international links of the spread of U.S. imperialism through this same system of Red Scare, Black Scare logic. Let's stay in the 1930s for a second to talk about the case of Angelo Hearn, whose case is something of an epicenter in the 20th century. In fact, as you write, the International Labor Defense once described it, the Angelo Hearn case, as the Dred Scott decision of the 20th century, which I hadn't known that until reading your book. Why was and is the Herndon case so important, and what did it exemplify in that period and maybe even today?
Yeah, so Angelo Hearn, in terms of jurisprudence, the Angelo Herndon case is the first case where the issue of free speech had been applied to a Black person. And around the same time, there's a lot of a few cases that apply to like the Scottsboro Boys also winding their way through the Supreme Court. But Angelo Hearn didn't sort of fit the bill of the Scottsboro Boys, who are considered to be this sort of poor, destitute, ignorant young boys who were railroaded due to the time, honored lie of raping a white woman. Angelo Herndon was a communist. He was assertive. He was an organizer and a labor leader. And so this really sort of challenged it really challenged sort of the limits of free speech, if you will. So there are several Supreme Court cases, one that was ultimately decided in his favor. But to back up, Herndon, who was a member of the Atlanta Unemployed Council, he had called for an interracial demonstration at the Fulton County Courthouse because the city of Atlanta had closed relief stations and was attempting to drop like 20,000 people from the relief roll. So this is in the throes of the Great Depression. And so he organizes this interracial march to the Fulton County Courthouse. And despite the fact that, officials tried to race bait and only negotiate with the white folks and continue to dispossess Black people, the protest was ultimately successful. And so the 20,000 families remained on the relief rolls, and actually $6,000 was added, was appropriated to these families, right? And so shortly after that, and this is when Angelo Herndon was arrested in July of 1932 and incarcerated, ultimately for being in possession of communist literature. That was a sort of pretext in which he was arrested, but of course, it was his organizing that got him into trouble. And he was ultimately charged under the Insurrection Act, like the Georgia Insurrection Act, which was dated back to slavery and had been implemented in response to like the Nat Turner Rebellion, and was basically, it carried with it the death penalty for anybody who incited insurrection against the Georgia state. And so, so specifically, he was charged under Section 56 of the Georgia Penal Code, which criminalized, quote, any attempt by persuasion or otherwise to induce others to join in any combined resistance to the lawful authority of the state, end quote. And that constituted an attempt to incite insurrection. And so here we see how the interracialism of that protest, the sort of militancy of that protest, and its success, its challenge to the attempt of the Atlanta City Council to dispossess not only white people but Black people, was seen as insurrection. It was seen as a challenge to the state. And so the prosecutor in that case went on to say, they red baited and black baited him. So it's like they were saying things like, think about your daughter, your white daughter, who is going to be open to Black male sexuality if Black people, if people like Herndon are able to run amok and push for equality of Black people, that they're trying to start a nigger Soviet republic in the U.S. South. And then, so one such quote from the prosecutor was, quote, the defendant claims to be interested in the unemployed, but that is just a disguise. He is only trying to stir up the races to foment and create trouble that will bring about an industrial revolution so he and his communist friends can set up a godless dictatorship in this country based on the style of the Bolsheviki dictatorship in Soviet Russia. So here we see he's like trying to stir up the races, right? He's under the sort of the tutelage of Moscow, because of course he couldn't possibly be organizing in response to the material conditions of the South, the racial terrorism. It has to be sort of some dictate of Moscow. And then he wants to expropriate landowners and white folks in the South. And so this was the logic that was used. He was ultimately found guilty, but the Southern justice that he received was that he didn't get the electric chair, but was sentenced to 20 years on a chain gang. After a series of appeals and a bunch of sort of direct action and organizing spearheaded by the International Labor Defense, he was not put on the chain gang. He was sort of released in the 11th hour. and ultimately won the Supreme Court case. So he was his conviction was overturned. So that is Angelo Hearn. There's much more to say about him, but he's just really important because he signified like everything that was dangerous to like U.S. capitalist racist society. He was a communist, he was Black, he was an effective organizer, he organized interracially, he challenged economic exploitation, and organized in a way that inhabited this kind of social equality that the South saw as like anathema to its heritage and its social order.
And of course, he's also important because Ben Davis Jr. was his lawyer, trial lawyer,
right?
Which you do get into a little bit in the book as well. Great, yeah, thank you for covering the importance of Herndon. I would like to transition to the second part of the book. I only have a handful, less actually, questions left for you. The second part of the book is all about governance and this, what you call the legitimating architecture of U.S. capitalist racist society. How did the Black Scare and the Red Scare longue durée, again, as you call it, congeal into a legal and an extra-legal apparatus through agencies like the BI, later to become the FBI, these committees that you write about, the Lusk and the Fish committees, revolutionary radicalism and Raycon, McCarthyism. And so we've all heard about McCarthyism, all right? Everyone knows who Joseph McCarthy was. But can you talk about some of these other legal frameworks, like the McCarran Act, Smith Act, Taft-Hartley, things that essentially made communism illegal and were considered widely by thinkers like Claudia Jones as harbingers of fascism?
Yeah, so I'll just sort of run through just the ones that I kind of like talk about. Just the so there are all these committees that are happening both at the federal level and the state level that are meant to interrogate the the spread of communist ideas and to basically, so they're meant to be exculpatory, but what they also do is construct the threat as they're happening. So they serve this kind of like dual function, and then they are embedded in the Black Scare and the Red Scare because, for example, like one of the questions that is asked by the Fish Committee, then the 1930s committee, is, do you believe in racial equality? And have you ever had a Negro in your home? And these are meant to signify whether or not one is a communist, right? So there's this sort of just slew of committees that are happening, but then there's also a cacophony of like legislation. I mentioned the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938, which is known as the McCormick Act. That is an act that required that people who work for the federal government register with the U.S. Attorney General and divulge that they are acting on behalf of a foreign power. Interestingly, the APSP was just indicted. The African People's Socialist Party was indicted under this particular act recently, a year or so ago now. You also
that's
have
all the way back to 1938. I want to emphasize that again.
Yes, and that 1930s moment is important because of, so this is by 1939, and a couple of the acts that I'll talk about in a second are a response to this, but the so-called Stalin-Hitler Pact happened, and so there is legislation that's passed that ostensibly is supposed to target both Nazism and communism, but ultimately only redounds to communism, right? And this is where we start to see the discourse about totalitarianism and communism and fascism as sort of two sides of the same coin, which we know is not true. Mm-hmm. But then you have the passage of the Voorhees Act in 1940, which strengthened the McCormick Act and just required for any organization that was ostensibly subjected to foreign control to register with the government. You have the Hatch Act of 1939, which was the foundation of the loyalty programs that would proliferate under Harry S. Truman, as well as the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, which was a list that ultimately gave radical organizations and even Black kind of liberal and left organizations the blues. You have the Alien Registration Act, or the Smith Act, which is one of the most important pieces of legislation for really decimating the Communist Party. This is the act that criminalized, quote, knowingly and willingly advocating, abetting, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government of the United States by force or violence, and circulating any literature that ostensibly articulates this. And of course, this, people like Claudia Jones and Ben Davis and Claude Lightfoot and others start to refer to this as the Thought Control Smith Act, because it's wholly based on ideas, and ideas begin to stand in for any real action. So in the Smith Act trials that started in 1948, the evidence that's used is like passages from the Communist Manifesto and articles and writings, but there's no acts. So this is unlike, the anarchist bombings that were happening that led to the Palmer raids and the so-called First Red Scare. These are just ideas. These are just thoughts and beliefs that people are being criminalized for. You have the Internal Security Act of 1950, or the McCarran Act, which was even more carceral than the Smith Act. It was kind of referred to as like the anti-communist law. This is where immigration checks, deportation, and harassment of Black people, of Black radicals in particular, but radicals of all stripes. This is really the law under which people are being harassed. There was a provision in the McCarran Act that required individuals and organizations to register with the Subversive Activities Control Board. There was also a provision for the collecting of security index cards, which meant that in the case of a national emergency, anybody who had one of these cards would be thrown in concentration camps. Of course, all of the people in the book had one of these, and that provision is actually not, much of the McCarran Act has been ruled unconstitutional. That provision has not.
Interesting.
Yes. Then you have, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which I mentioned earlier. That's the McCarran-Walter Act that reduced immigration from the Caribbean to only 100 people. And then you have the Communist Control Act of 1954, which was an amendment to the McCarran Act, which actually outlawed the Communist Party. And that's really important because in this country, we're supposed to have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, but this party was singled out and ruled illegal, right? And then, within this sort of apparatus is also the Taft-Hartley Act, which, among other things, required trade union officials to file an affidavit swearing that they were not members of the Communist Party, that they did not support the Communist Party, that they were not affiliated in any way. And actually, many labor leaders were jailed under violations of Taft-Hartley. And this is why this is when we begin to see the sort of hollowing out of unionizing, and why unions are in the state that they're in today, where there's a lot of corruption, a lot of kind of labor aristocracy types of mentality that are operating, because some of the most apt and sort of able organizers, some of the most militant like labor leaders, were in fact communists, or at least sympathetic to it, right? So that's just the legislation, and those are just the ones that I highlight because they directly impacted in some way the sort of the people that I draw on. But this, and that's just the legislative branch.
Right.
So this just goes to show the sort of ubiquity of anti-communist governance, and also the sort of the social ramifications of that is that it's so sort of all-encompassing on the one hand, but also arbitrary in its enforcement on the other hand, that folks begin to regulate themselves and to become fearful to be accused of being a communist, to associate with anybody who could be accused of being a communist, to sort of snitch on each other, to try to push out anybody who's accused of communism from their organizations. And it really, there's just a atmosphere of like fear and distrust, and it really limits the type of organizing and education people are willing to engage in, because you could lose your job, you could lose your livelihood. Obviously, you could be called before one of these committees. And if you dare to plead the Fifth Amendment, which is your right, then you are just considered a Fifth Amendment communist. So there's really no protection from this large anti-radical dragnet. And this whole sort of apparatus of legislation lends to that atmosphere.
And as you just put, I mean, that's just the legislative branch, but you also talk about the judiciary at the executive branch and the Supreme Court as well. And one striking analysis that you offer, I think, is this question of states' rights, and which you refer to at some point in the book as the deferral or the abdication of the federal judiciary in civil rights cases, such as Herndon's, which you just talked about, and as well as during early anti-lynching movement. Can you talk a little bit about states' rights and the role of the judiciary in upholding Black scare, Red scare ideology, and how that might manifest in this period you're talking about, but also today?
Yeah, so overwhelmingly, so the court was guilty of sort of reifying the Black scare and the Red scare through both action and inaction. So it was not just the rulings, but it was, again, its refusal to take up cases and kick them back to the very states that were the most racist and the most anti-labor, the most anti-worker, and thus, abdicating its responsibility to actually allow for justice for racial and political minorities. And so, I write that the judiciary tended to evade aggressive enforcement of personal rights, especially as it applied to what can be considered dissidents, right? Whether it's racial dissidents or economic dissidents, so people who had beliefs that defy capitalist racism. This continued to be left largely to the discretion of local preference and state constitutional safeguards, even as we know that most of civil rights legislation that has benefited Black folks has come from the federal government, precisely because the states, especially the southern states, are notoriously racist and have been, hell bent on rolling back the rights of Black folks, militants, and especially, radicals. And so the reluctance to enforce individual liberties regarding free speech stood in sharp contrast to the vigorous enforcement of liberty contract allegedly enshrined within the due process clauses of the Fifth and the 14th Amendments. Much of the Supreme Court's hostility to protecting radical speech had to do with the role of labor in pushing for those protections. The court preferred to protect and uphold employers' rights and contractual freedom, and to uphold anti-worker convictions for criminal conspiracy, vagrancy, violation of assembly laws, and injunctions against strikes, boycotts, and labor organizing. Thus, in overwhelmingly siding with capital over labor, radicals and Blacks, the Supreme Court, the federal courts, and the criminal legal system at the state and local levels played an instrumental role in anti-communist governance. So essentially, by protecting corporations, by protecting, capitalists, the U.S. government failed to protect the majority of its citizens, especially when it came to speech and forms of militant organizing that were meant to improve the material conditions of Black people, workers, Black workers, etc. And so in terms of, do we see that today? Absolutely, right? We see the court being more militant, I think, in overturning things more recently, whether it's Roe v. Wade, whether it's affirmative action, but then its refusal to take up cases or to rule on cases that could be to the benefit of whether it's Black people or trans people, other political minorities. The court refuses to rule, and it waxes and wanes in its progressivism, if you will. But even so-called progressive courts, there are liberal anti-communists, right? They protect some rights just enough so that they can be, so that there's loopholes. There's always ways to maneuver around these rulings, right? So what Brown versus Board of Education is a case in point. There's this huge landmark decision, but then in Brown too, it's saying like these changes, desegregation can be implemented in all deliberate speed. So it gets again kicked back to the states who have no incentive to desegregate whatsoever. And this tends to be the case with the Supreme Court, because it is in the final analysis, it is a, hallmark institution of the U.S. state, which is meant to preserve the status quo as much as possible, right? So.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just kind of, I have two more questions for you if you've got time.
Sure.
I'm going to actually skip to the end because you're talking a lot about kind of contemporary currents. You already mentioned the African People's Socialist Party. Maybe you can talk a little more about how we see the prevailing anti-communist and anti-Black attitudes today suffused into our modern political consciousness. But we also see, and you write about this in the conclusion of your book, the condemnations of critical race theory, of this thing called wokeism, and the resurgence of this idea of cultural Marxism. How can we combat this way of thinking today, especially keeping in mind the threat of creeping fascism that you diagnose?
Yeah, so I think that part of what is important is to think about and take seriously the way that like liberal democracy is amenable to fascism. So there are people who say like liberalism is fascism. I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but I would say it's highly amenable. And historically, the United States has been much more favorable and accommodating to fascism than it has been to communism, right? Or socialism or any sort of left-wing radical ideology. And I think that that becomes important today because we have a lot of anti-communism, common sense anti-communism coming from, you know, even our so-called friends on the left, through all sorts of discourses, whether it be all states are bad, which is not a very dialectical understanding, you know, whether it be you know, believing what the U.S. State Department has to say about a place like China. You know, even though we know the United States lies about every single thing, we tend to believe the U.S. when it's talking about when it's talking about its so-called enemies. There is the sort of sectarianism that is rampant in the left that celebrates or that can be sort of supportive of the repression of particular groups, right? Particular ways of thinking, again, in ways that are not helpful, that are not going to save anybody, right? That actually just end up undermining everybody's free speech, right? It ends up undermining everybody's ability to articulate a vision that challenges the United States. And so, you know, we also see how it's interesting, just as sort of anti-communism was used to undermine Black struggle while also making particular liberal concessions. I think that so too do we see like wokeism, the attack on wokeism as being another attack on Black people. It's in the aftermath of 2020. So people won't say like these fucking Black people, but they'll say wokeism, which becomes synonymous with like a Black insurgency, right? With Black people's attempts to call out both ideological or like material injustice, but also the forms of social relations that reproduce hierarchy, you know, that reproduce an inability to have a correct analysis, whether it be the sort of inability to interrogate settler colonialism or the reduction of any acknowledgement of race to so-called identity politics, that this ultimately weakens the left through sectarianism and through an inability to fully grasp like what we're up against. But then it also becomes a way to reproduce like anti-Black racial oppression without sort of using the N-word, if you will. Right. And so I think that part of what Black Scare, Red Scare allows us to do is to see the long history of these realities, and to be mindful, right? Because again, some of this stuff is just so common sense that we don't even catch it. But I think it requires us to be mindful of, like, again, the saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and that these things continue to happen and continue to build upon this broad sort of mode of anti-communist governance that hasn't really gone away. the targets may have shifted, for example, to like the terrorist. And as we know, that shift is rooted in anti-communism. I was just reading something that talked about how through the sort of Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and sort of involvement in the Middle East, there was this meeting in Israel where a bunch of right-wing US people were there, and basically the trope of the Soviet-backed terrorist came about, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this sort of seamless transition from like the communists to the terrorists that we begin to see, that has the same types of logics. Obviously, it's shifted somewhat, especially after the war on terror. The sort of the specificities have shifted, but it's based on that same sort of security state apparatus that's meant to construct these like perpetual others whose ideas and whose very existence are a threat to the US state. So we also see, for example, the subjection of the Free Cop City protesters to domestic terrorism laws, right? I just talked about like Angelo Hearn in an insurrection. It's the same type of thing, that these people are being disciplined for their organizing. And not only that, RICO charges. So there's a way that we see a similar conflation of criminality, which I also write about in the book, of criminality and activism, that it becomes criminal to challenge the sort of doxa of the US state and its foundations, including like policing. And so this same time, and it's like there's 61 people or something. And so these large trials are meant to intimidate. They're meant to neutralize and to criminalize like movement and activism. And this again has a very, very long history dating back to the industrial workers of the world, right? So
yeah, which we didn't get to talk as much about, but you do write extensively about the IWW and that period too. Well, I've got one more question, and that is, you just mentioned history rhyming, and we see that rhyme of some of these things that you've mentioned today with the pro-peace, pro-Palestine movement. Not only the subjugation and the othering of the notion of terrorism, but as well violent political pushback from state forces to against the often student-led pro-Palestine movement. We're seeing a similar kind of threat of peace, perhaps, to invoke the subtitle of one of your chapters. So I'm curious about maybe what we're seeing with the doxing, or the public release of information of Palestinian, Black, Arab, South Asian, Muslim, undocumented, and international students at universities like Harvard. Is this a kind of sort of continuation or a parallel that to the period that you're writing about in this book?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, right? Because the way, like in the period under study, like the way to sort of discredit or discount something is to call it communist, right? Now, in this exact moment, the way to discredit something is to call it anti-Semitic, right? And just as sort of the ostensible threat, so the ostensible interrogation of the threat of fascism and communism was used as a bludgeon to beat back communism, like so too is this cover of like protecting Jewish people or combating anti-Semitism used to beat back radicalism. It's used to beat back calls for decolonization and liberation and to stop the war intensified genocide that's happening in Gaza and in Palestine writ large, to the point where like the language, like calling something a genocide is being considered hate speech, or saying from the river to the sea is being considered hate speech. And interestingly, we also see, you mentioned like there's a sort of overrepresentation of like Black organizers and activists who are being targeted, but then there's also like the manipulation of like Blackness being used. So for example, Palestinians use this watermelon symbol, and the Zionists are trying to say that like Palestinians are racist because historically watermelon has been used as an anti-African American thing, trying to sort of challenge like Black Palestinian solidarity, which is particularly strong at this moment. So that type of thing. Or, you know, you have some stupid celebrity saying like, if the hostages that had been taken on October 7th were Black people, even if it had been 10 Black people, then the government would have intervened. And it's like, are you fucking stupid? No, that is not what it had. Historically, this has not been the case. And then,
right.
you know, if it's a rich Black person, sure. If you're ASAP Rocky or fucking Brittany Griner or something, yes, but that has to do with celebrity and money. That has nothing to do with any intrinsic care that the government has for Black people. Perhaps what it gestures towards is, you know, the organizing power and potential of Black people, but that is repressed and disciplined. So when, in 20 states, when we have these anti-movement and anti-organizing laws that crop up in the wake of 2020, not in the wake of the insurrection or of January 6th, mind you, it goes to show that is not something that the United States respects or that or takes, you know, seriously. It's something that the United States co-ops or represses. And so all of this to say that Blackness somehow, even in the case of Palestine, becomes a threat, right? It becomes something that that is constantly harkened back to as potential danger, or people saying like, if it can happen in Palestine, you know, it can happen here. The Black people here can mobilize in the same way, or like BLM are terrorists, so of course they would support Hamas, like this type of shit, right? It's like, it always somehow comes back to Black people and the threat of Blackness. And so this is part of what Black Scare, Red Scare reminds us, that every anti-radical impulse has a sort of undercurrent of anti-Black or a concern about Black people and Black empowerment. And likewise, every concern about Black liberation or Black militancy has an undercurrent of, well, what other subversive forces are influencing this, or will have the ability to infiltrate through these, you know, susceptible Blacks.
Right. And all those tropes you bring up, they're recycled and repackaged and and repurposed. We see that very evidently today, I think. Well, this was great. Thank you so much, Dr. CBS, for donating your time to come on and talk about your amazing new book, Black Scare, Red Scare. Congratulations on the book, if I haven't congratulated you yet. And I urge all viewers and listeners, buy the book. More importantly, read the book, of course. And in closing, what's next for Dr. CBS? What have you got on the horizon?
Yeah, so I am pregnant. I am like 8 months pregnant, so I will be having a baby, which is a whole other sort of, you know, project, raising a revolutionary. And then in terms of projects, I'm working on a book on mutual comradeship. So an ethical, epistemological, and political practice at the intersection of state repression and Black radicalism, specifically in like the 1950s. Here at Harvard, I'm looking at comparing sort of what I call the McCarthyist conjuncture to organizing that was happening in the 60s and 70s around 4 themes, which are triple oppression, fascism, or anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, and anti-war. So, you know, there's often a sort of hard demarcation that's made between like the old left and the new left. And so part of what I'm looking at is the continuities and analysis and organizing. So yeah, you know, and that's what I'm working on. Sort of. I'm not really working actively on anything except making a child, but those are the projects that are sort of in the wings right now.
Well, very good. And congratulations, of course.
Thank you.
On the new baby whenever they come. And we look forward to these projects you've got coming out. Keep in touch, and we'll make sure to have you on again when anything else is published. So thanks so much. Really appreciate it again.
Thank you.